Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Welcome back. This is Ryder Richards. Now, let's step behind the curtain or fourth wall or whatever you call it in a podcast. I've been having a rocky life situation lately, and I'm recording this episode remotely, so please forgive me for any delays in episodes being released or diminished audio quality. Yeah, okay, let's get back to it. So, today we're going to be covering the multitudinous aspects of accelerationism, pulling just a little bit from Accelerate, the Accelerationist Reader, which has several new and old essays to really help map out the terrain, even be critical of accelerationism. So, of course, I'm going to be drawing from Malign Velocities by Benjamin Noys, which I talked about last episode. And maybe keep this in mind. I found accelerationism to be compelling because we typically only think of this sort of radical response to capitalism being to reject it or deny it, which of course closes our mind to other potential opportunities. And of course, this podcast is called Let Us Think About It, so we might as well spend some time considering ideas we normally don't. And of course, mostly these are ideas from smarter people than me. So, which by the way isn't all that hard. Anyway. There's a whole lot to cover because of how compelling and fascinating this topic is, and I'm not going to get into all of it or even most of it, but we can at least scratch the surface, and there's still some really good ideas in here, really solid things. So let's just hop into it. Part 1. The Handbrake. In 1879, there was a horrible train wreck. The weather conditions were really foggy, and this train became derailed and plummeted off of a bridge into the water below. Now, not knowing what happened, because it was foggy, of course, they sent out another train to investigate. And only by speedily applying the emergency brake did this train avoid the same fate. Now, this story kind of inspired poets who, at this weird odd time of machine worship, declared the locomotive as a saint of the future, to which the response was, "It is quite unnecessary to become an angel, since a locomotive is worth more than the finest pair of wings." Now, this incident influenced the eclectic philosopher Walter Benjamin, who is just super cool, and by the way, I think that's what eclectic means. I don't know. Maybe esoteric? That's another good word to use when you're in a jam and trying to describe a cool person. But either way, Benjamin discusses the emergency brake of history, which is obviously pulling the brake, but not necessarily falling back into nostalgia. We're not regressing here. It's not like we're going to have some sort of tribal or pastoral vision that we're going to enact. It's really a reconsidering of technology and capitalism as they commingle into these forms of speedy production, all the while, of course, gaining momentum into the unknown. Now, there are aspects of Benjamin that are, of course, accelerationist, but in other regards, he attempts to really disrupt the capitalist bent as it propels forward on this rapid trajectory into the fog. Walter Benjamin began, at some point, interacting with Bertolt Brecht, I think that's how you say his name, who was an even more kind of radical disruptor in his life and everything else, and he really criticized the sleek, streamlined technological future. There is this kind of little story that I think that he ended up writing that I think is good, where there's a man that he calls a slob. And this guy he just can't stand the Bauhaus modernist aesthetic. So when the owner leaves the house, this guy goes in and he just violently rearranges all this sort of Bauhaus modernist furniture. And he pastes magazine pages onto the walls that were formerly blank, of course. And this is all just to leave some sort of trace of human presence amidst this sleekness. So the slob is not actually unsophisticated. He just revels in his humanity. And I think that's something that we often miss. Now, this seems to be one of the things the technological imperative just rushes right past, right? This is humanness. So Noys discusses this sort of poetry about the angelic locomotive, and Walter Benjamin's take on rushing into the future and encountering disaster. You don't actually have to halt progress or even derail the train, but just consider pulling the handbrake until we can at least see where we're going. Now, for this other kind of cautionary tale, this is about communism and capitalism and the influence of the machine. Now, as you all know, the means of capitalist production, it was supposed to be wrested away from the capitalists to serve the communist ends. That is, the community of humans who do not exploit each other but help each other. But the broader argument here is to question if it is indeed possible to use the machinery of production, which is of course built and designed under capitalist ideals, and not somehow smuggle in the negative aspects of capitalism with this machinery. For instance, the Soviet Union. They tried communism, sort of, but it had a lot of problems with organization, and there was this overarching goal of the state. More than bread for the proles, it became the need to strengthen the war machine, which was to save the state, the Union, right? Which in hindsight was, of course, probably wise given the rise of Germany and all this other kind of stuff. But this goal warped what communism should be into a nationalist ethos. So when the community goal becomes swamped by the threat of patriotic extinction, the nation required sacrifice as fast as possible. And the people were the resource decimated by the nation. But of course, the Union survived, if that's what you care about. So the machine here saved Russia, sort of. But really, can you call it communism without a community? Or for that matter, can you actually call it democracy when the citizens' votes don't count, which is the Russia of today? So I'm not trying to throw stones here because, of course, America and other nations have done several things too, but the machinic future ends up costing lives in many ways, reshaping lifestyles through work, culture, society, ideology, nationalism. And at what point in this rush for survival does somebody yank the brake?
Part 2. Marxism. The frame.
Now, the ghost underlying much of accelerationism is Marxism. So, you can lean into Marx, condemn him, ignore him, whatever you want to do, but he was really one of the first to dig into the warping of society and labor through the machine. Now, he mostly emphasized class struggle, but a lot of this was predicated upon the bourgeoisie having the capital, which meant that they could afford and build the machines. So maybe what we could say here is that our runaway train is capitalism, but that's also the technology of production. They are kind of one and the same thing. Now, automation was supposed to free men of labor, right? It was supposed to save labor, but in an inverse fashion, our relationship to labor and the machines somehow subverted man into the servant who thought he was the master. So yes, we have become slaves to the steam engine or some other kind of engine. Now, the original thought was capitalism would collapse under its own excesses, right? It doesn't seem to make sense. There's a lot of contradictions in there. Now, the production here would extract too much at too little cost, which would drain resources and the labor pool. The people would get angry, they would rebel when capital imbalance became too extreme. But somehow this perfect mousetrap just keeps returning just enough cheese, right? Just enough comfort, just enough hope that we do not rebel. The thought was really that the masses, of course, that's us, right? The proletariat, we would unite. We would turn against the machines of capital. And these would become, of course, our tools. We would overtake the machines and they would help us fuel the revolution. But somewhere along the way, we became the fuel. We are the human coal for the mechanical monster. And of course, maybe in a less dramatic fashion, as Marx says in his 1858 text, The Fragment on Machines. We're merely the linkages between the machines. We actually just complete the system. The machine appears to do the work, transferring our labor into the product. But for man, these labor-saving devices, they have not delivered the 16-hour work week. We seem to be working more, so they are actually labor shaping. But what's funny about this labor shaping is they end up extracting more from us while requiring less skill. The automation actually diminishes man into a link in a broader process, which reshapes us. And man does not get the credit for any of this, the machine gets the credit. So for Karl Marx, the means of labor, this is a combination of living labor plus machine labor, which is dead labor. this becomes synonymous with capital, and you can also call capital the means of production. Blah, blah, blah. Lots of terminology here, and of course, it can get confusing until we remember that old elementary school song that we used to sing, in church for me. It was a capital is dead labor, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. But seriously, kids, if we consider capitalism the form or the frame, and what happens within it as the content, we can now see that the frame converts everything inside it into itself, into its own perspective. And it orients everything towards its own vanishing point. This is, once again, the train tracks disappearing into the fog. Once capital was really kind of labor plus tangible products, right? These are things that could be bought and sold, and we've talked about this, but in the 70s, finance moved into speculative abstraction, and now our linkage, our role in all this, our labor on the assembly line, is to be data mined. And this is done with behavioral cataloging and the subsequent manipulation of us through the attention economy, which is all made possible by big data and surveillance capitalism. And of course, we have done episodes on all these, so you really don't need me telling you any of this. It's just kind of a rehash of the new colonization of territories into this kind of bizarre transcendent nether realm that we need to keep in mind as we consider how capitalism has shifted from the machine into this nebulous transmigratory place. Now, the key issues that accelerationism really starts to begin to tackle is this expansion without collapse. That is, how do we escape when the act of rebellion itself is the work of capitalism? So, as Ray Brassier and others have pointed out, within the frame of capitalism, all the interlinking systems are shaped to a capitalist intent, a kind of capitalist perspective. So, once again, picture those train tracks vanishing on the horizon. While we want to slow down, we want to pull the handbrake and jump the track into human-centered ideas, there's really just too much interlinked momentum here. The revolution's goal was to actually use the tools of capitalism in its aftermath, of course, but, and this is the key point, we cannot use the tools and remain free of the vampiric capitalist taint. So in step 46, Sacred Economics, Charles Eisenstein offered several ways to transition from current capitalism to something new, and he talks about the revolution using the bones of capitalism as the scaffolding from which we can mature. But the problem is, are capitalist machines of production? Yeah, they're built embedded and coded with extractive intent, which lets the capitalist ethos be reintroduced, igniting our preconditioned desires all over again. Now, this point of view takes into account that it is not only the physical and infrastructural problems with capitalism, it's not just the machine, but it's also our social and libidinal economy, that is, our desire for things and stuff and comfort and how we relate to the world. Now, any revolution must ignite our desires beyond our current desires. It must at least reorient them, point them into a different set of values. While, of course, it also kind of has to solve for the current problems or bypass them. And unfortunately, surrounded by the bones of capitalism, we're kind of like an alcoholic in a bar, or maybe a gambler in a casino, told not to enjoy themselves. And humans just really aren't good at saying no. We actually need to be able to say yes to something, yes to enjoyment as well. Now, this is a problem that leads us to reconsider accelerationism, because if our social value is linked to production value, which is also linked to the libidinal economy, well, then reformulating all these all at once, that seems unlikely unless we either universally transcend or the entire system breaks and implodes. Now, from my point of view, universal transcendence seems super cool, but of course my neighbor is kind of waiting in a bunker with guns and canned beans for Jesus to return instead of, hanging out taking shrooms with me. So I think this might be a hard sell to a large swath of the population.
Side note, schizoid interweaving.
Interestingly, Deleuze and Guattari bring up the schizoid desire for lines of flight. This is our schizophrenic desire to fragment, to embrace irrationality as we break free and deterritorialize the system. They also bring up the concept of machinic enslavement, which, oddly enough, might be more positive than just being pulled out of the machine to become an autonomous subject. Yeah, machinic enslavement sounds bad, but on a purely materialistic level, it's really not preferable to be without machines. But of course, on a psychological level, enslavement sounds awful, right? So, without machinic influence, though, I mean, what does our psychological level even look like? And this is something that gets kind of messy, is that we're both schizoid in that we're fragmenting ourselves, but we're also sort of linked back together by the machine. So one of the problems is our libidinal economy, and these are our desires shaped by society. This feeds our values and excesses right back into the system. So you may feel alienated, split from yourself, split from others, disenfranchised, left only with these desires that are pushing through you with no one to share them with. But all of this ends up today being routed through technological means. It's also shaped prediscursively by work and society, meaning that the very shape of our thoughts and desires are born within the form of capital. Our desire is the paint within the frame of capitalism. At some point, we cannot separate work life from social life. We cannot separate ourselves from the influences, as we have somehow become an appendage to the machine, somewhat controlled by the machine. So what ends up happening is, of course, your phone is not an external organ to you. You're actually merely a replaceable limb for the sort of basilicopede known as the global technological apparatus.
Part 3. The Logic of Acceleration.
Given the positions that we're in, no one can really see a way back, right? Backwards isn't an option. Even if you want some sort of regressive nostalgia, yeah, it's not going to work to build a past and ignore the possibilities of the future. That's just not what humans do. So we end up having to lean into the future. Now, the futurists, they were a bit too bombastic, overshooting with passion and zeal as a way to engage the libidinal desires, right? The imaginary. Now, today's accelerationism, yeah, it's more sober. It's a lot based on theory, and it's taking cues from Marx, Deleuze Guattari, Negri, Jameson, Fisher, and a lot of others. Now, it considers the excessive machinic impulses that show up, which, guys like Nick Land's cyberpunk futurism really discusses. And the idea is not to be too schizo. It's not to be too sacrificial of the human. Which is honestly good to hear, right? Because while Land broke a lot of ground in an artsy, interesting way, it also required maybe way too much nihilistic faith to follow him. Instead, acceleration has turned into a real discussion about which certain elements need to be accelerated, but maybe not all of them. For instance, if we have something like a decline of the symbolic exchange, where the chain between signifier and signified, from master signifier to the signifier, is somehow disrupted, well, do you want to reestablish a chain? That is, a linkage, a causal linkage. Or do you want them to all be running in parallel, this sort of meaningless lines of flight that are all taking off simultaneously? I don't know, right? But these are options, but we don't actually have to break everything. Maybe they're just certain things. Maybe abstraction should be broken. Maybe symbolic representation is the problem that homogenizes everything. Once again, I don't know. And this is all difficult to parse. But in accelerationism, there is a need to distinguish between this Promethean rise, that is the spirited ambition to reach the stars and activate our imaginative drives. And this was something the futurists were really trying to do, right? And part of the problem here is it tends to privilege a reliance on rationality and logic, which of course tends to deform society and humanity. And then of course we have this other side that we need to distinguish from, which is a side of recognizing our plight as being miserable and somehow recentering the needs of humanity. Now, you may say socialism will recenter humanity, right? But there's this unfortunately incommensurate vibe there, right? And I hate to sort of bring this up, but excitement and socialism, yeah, those just don't really sound exciting. They don't go together. They don't align very well. And egalitarianism is really, it's just not sexy, especially when you're doing something unfair like comparing it to rockets. Yeah, and this is the other problem, is egalitarianism is often confused with equality and flattened freedoms, which in this case, yeah, maybe that is the handbrake, right? To flatten the impulsive desires that we dream. And that's, I don't know, what is that? I've been circling around it, but the question remains, how do you manifest the spirit of man at his boldest while denying him his rudest desires? So I know it's easy to rail against capitalism, but accelerationism reminds us that capitalism has always been a revolutionary force.
Communism is not radical, it is capitalism that is radical.
This is Bertolt Brecht. Jill Lipovetsky says,
Revolutionary actions are not those which aim to overthrow the system of capital, which has never ceased to be revolutionary, but those which complete its rhythm in all its radicality. That is to say, actions which accelerate the metamorphic process of bodies.
These bodies, however, according to Althusser, may already be processed. As he says,
The human being is dead.
they're transformed into a passive machine part, no longer possessed of any
Irreducible element that would revolt against capital.
Now, equally, there is this nostalgic conservative premise in blaming capitalism. And Lyotard calls out Marx a lot for considering the past as somehow natural or naturalism, so that he can turn around and decry capitalism as if it somehow owed us something. This is fascinating, right? Because we don't often think of it. But why do we think we're owed something, especially by capitalism? And if so, can we also see what capitalism has given to us? Because Lyotard says it has given us the ability to throw off norms and obligations, to reconsider internalized guilt, or even to choose to be cynical. And Lyotard, and this, by the way, got him on the naughty list, he goes so far as to suggest that the workers enjoy their enslavement and suffering. He says the workers take pleasure in it as a form of jouissance. That somehow mobilizes their desire. Now, this is the dark part. We actually enjoy our suffering. And even if this is because it identifies us and gives us a place from which to voice discontent, which we, oddly enough, draw pleasure from negativity, not the discontent itself, but just the pleasure in voicing it, because it's about intensities here. It's not really a positive negative switch. And capitalism here is the natural enemy. In much the same way travel destinations make money off tourists while they despise them, right? We tend to do the same thing. Now, we can also do things like look at social media for artificial reputational defense and jouissance, right? Like, all this stuff is toxic, and people just keep going back there for more negative enjoyment. They take pleasure in trolling and defending, and yet I would argue that it's primarily self-imposed suffering. So we can blame the frame, right? It's very easy to blame capitalism, which of course subverts us and shapes us, no denying that. But accelerationism really tries to push the point that a little bit more egalitarianism, or maybe some more politics to claim that everything should be held in common, is really not going to change anything. And part of this is because our desires and ourselves and our systems have all been shaped to not agree with that, to see that this is kind of a throttling or a totalitarianism, is anti-individual. And as we have become inextricably tangled in and tied up in machinic processes, machinic enslavement, the very human desire to go beyond this kind of surplus desire, it might be our only way out. It might be the thing that can still be channeled into moving past certain limits which would somehow, if broken, open up new paths into new ways of being.
Port 4, Malign Velocities.
So, as a slight repeat, what accelerationism is really trying to do is use the abstractions to represent value as tools to push us forward. It's kind of interesting, right? There's this whole idea of Baudrillard and symbolic exchange and all this kind of stuff, right? But for instance, we know that a $5 bill or social media are merely abstract representations of value. Yet it does not mean that they do not have real effects on the world. The idea that we encourage and amplify these abstractions provokes a new world, a world in which we are already embedded but hesitant to completely embrace. We have really one hand applying pressure on the brake and one hand over our eyes. So Benjamin Noys, he goes through a history of futurism into accelerationism and says the accelerationists are looking for a new inventiveness in the face of crisis. And rightly, they are resisting calls for sacrifice and austerity, which of course usually fall on the victims of crisis rather than those who caused it. But he also cautions that they employ a
quasi-Marxist cunning of reason, where the worst will produce the good, to immerse in the destructive to extract a power to break capitalism. Now, this is very much cybernetic theory, or maybe even a psychoanalytic approach, where the power of freedom is not without but within. Defeat the evil empire by becoming more sadistic than the sadist, in order to, clear a path to the light. Now, the real problem of championing this type of apocalyptic martyrdom is that, as Alain Badiou says, in their haste to find a line of flight out of capitalism, they ironically reflect the accelerative logic of capital itself. So in dissolving reality, they mirror capital's dissolution of reality and thus fall right back into it. Now, a great example Benjamin Noys discusses is Godard's film Weekend. This is crazy. And this fits into this chapter in his book Malign Velocities on George Bataille. That's not how you say his name, but whatever. It's his notions of the general economy as shit and recycled waste and anality, these things that people don't pay attention to, as a kind of balancing mechanism. And the whole thing is kind of amazing, and we really need to dedicate a whole episode to it, but this is maybe just a taste of it. That sounded gross. Now, in the movie, there is a traffic jam scene for 8 minutes, which represents the blockage or stoppage. The excremental flows are thwarted. Now, there's this couple that are on their way to have a weekend vacation, and this is a bourgeois married couple with, they both have secret lovers and no principles, and they're actually planning to murder each other. Great start, right? Don't you just identify with all these characters? Now, finally, escaping and free of this blockage, they're both pieces of poo that escaped the shitty city. Hooray! But of course, on the vacay, they are abducted by this barbaric sort of, socialist hippie tribe who are, of course, cannibals and even cannibals of themselves. This is so gross, right? Now, why do I bring all this up? Because the point implied by Godard is that barbarism seems to be the only way to get to socialism. We can only overcome the horror of the bourgeoisie by even more horror. Ouch. And what's really sad is the socialist, barbarous tribes, they are experiencing a nihilistic exhaustion themselves, because even at their extremes, they have basically become flattened and passionless, even while pooping and eating other people and repooping them back out, right? Just so gross, and they're just flattened, right? So there is no smooth transition, is what he's trying to say, from those who hold power and wealth in socialism without this barbaric consumption so that we may regenerate. What he's saying is we have to turn everything into shit in order for the new flowers to grow. But of course, there's no joy or passion here in self-destruction, right? This is not the sort of jouissance. They're just a flattened equivalence of all values. And this is a testament to the path of acceleration. The social rejuvenation only occurs after a nihilistic homogenization, an undifferentiated shit pile. And from there, it's left to grow the new dreams, hopefully without us. Part 5. Terminal Desire. The world of labor is confronted as one of future horror, endless and trivial. Accelerationism provides an answer by turning the horror of work into the jouissance of machinic immersion. Benjamin Noys covers a lot of ground in Malign Velocities. He goes from Thomas Pynchon's 1973 novel Gravity's Rainbow, and he talks about Victor Tosk's Influencing Machine from 1919. He talks about cyberfuturism. He talks about music like machine techno and vaporwave. He even talks about sex work machines, right? And he talks about the Marquis de Sade and how this shows us the endless erotic possibilities until all sex becomes work, repetition, and labor. And of course, the reverse is equally true. Labor injected with desire, a synthesis of desire and machine, becomes all labor. So here's what happens. We're already in alienating labor, but we keep on trying to make it all at once sexy. Yeah, it's sexy to work, yet sex at work is also taboo. And this triggers a kind of rebellious desire for more sex at work without actually having any sex at work. Now, Noys says this is integrating repetitive and deadening circuit of the sexual drive into the deadening circuit of labor. More broadly, we're enticed into the machine with sex.
The sexy machine offers us endless, repetitive pleasure, which is really a disguised future of boredom and enslavement, machinic immersion. It is the horror of the prostitute who mingles work with the small pleasures it affords, unable to separate labor and pleasure, left with kind of a confused desire caught in repetition and wanting only to escape into the mechanical sensations with no thought. Now, this is a point that struck me in Noys' book. The modern self-deadening impulse is rampant. Benjamin Noys says, the desire for immersion and forgetting is generated out of the psychopathologies which capitalism induces. Now, in our repetitive work, we grow darkly jealous and relate to the machine, wanting to no longer feel. And yet, in an ecstatic frenzy to be more human, we attempt to feel more, leaving us only more empty and more despairing. The promise of machinic or cyber merging is, well, part one, the desire to be useful, and two, to be part of something bigger than our isolated self. And at some point, we must recognize these desires and either uncouple or offer alternatives that are not terminally negative. One point is to really reconsider the definition of desire and pleasure. Desire is compulsive. It is demanded that we chase it and consume it. It overrides the slower, more sensuous, and lasting aspects of pleasure. Now, Timothy Brennan says, of course, socialism could offer pleasure at a slower pace. We could actually confront and thwart our rabid pursuit of desire with the choice to pursue pleasure. Now, in the end, accelerationism honestly acknowledges pain, but it also transforms that pain into jouissance. And in converting the pain into a source of pleasure, Noys says, making the transition is going hard to go soft, and a peculiar mixture of machismo and the valorization of feminized immersion. If anything, accelerationism's recognition of the pain returns this to a collective struggle, where we recognize enforced pathologies and are not trying to offer false consolations. But it is still peculiarly contradictory. It's really a death drive pathos, to rush towards what causes us misery rather than yanking the brake. The more viable solution may be to recognize and de-link these causes of misery rather than celebrate them and rush even faster into the fog as we lay the tracks in front of the train. Many thanks for sticking with me on this. So if you can't tell, I'm still fascinated by accelerationism. You're probably going to hear a little bit more about it in future episodes. But until then, I hope this is giving you enough to chew on. And if you found this episode helpful in any way, please consider sharing it with a friend or a colleague. Maybe let them reconsider jumping into the machine, right? Making themselves a better cog. So coming up, I do have some more reading for another super cool topic, and this is mimetic desire. I only know the basics right now, but find it super fascinating, and I really have a lot of reading to do. And then I want to jump into things like the scapegoating machine, the violence in architecture, and do a whole episode on camouflage, because I got some cool thoughts on it. But given my rocky life situation right now, I can't promise anything on the timing of any of these. I'm sorry for that. But for those of you who support the show, many thanks for your kindness and faith in me. Now, also, if you don't support the show and would like to, just go to letusthinkaboutit.com for a one-time donation or monthly support. Or just sign up for our newsletter. That could work too. All right, once again, many thanks. This is Ryder Richards wishing you happiness and safety.